You're watching Medfield TV.
From the water that people water their lawns with. You see what I'm saying?
No, because
So
the
how many-
issue,
how many-
is the permitting. So we have a limit on how much water we can withdraw.
Right.
And so right now, some of that water for people who want to pay potable water rates, including sewer treatment rates for the
Right.
water they put on their lawn, the water department has an interest in selling as much of its water up to capacity as it can, because it makes money doing that.
Right.
If we have a development and there's more people living in town and they need water to drink and use, that's a higher use than putting it on your lawn. So the issue here is not that we're just somehow or
It
another
is,
not
but
using.
what I'm saying is using the water puts the water into the system that flows to the wastewater treatment plant, as opposed to water going on the lawn and going back into the ground.
Yeah,
You see what I'm saying?
yeah.
So when
but I
you
don't
do
get
that,
the
you're
point.
subtracting water directly.
But I get
from
that.
the
but-
ground.
So you're suggesting that
pointing that out.
what you're saying is that we should have as our number one priority in this town, recharging of the aquifer, and we
Yes.
should not look at developing anything
Right.
that involves people using more water.
Correct. Because there's a safe yield, and groundwater resources are finite. And when you get close to that safe yield, the
So
other
you-
thing I want to point out is
But
our
I
five
want
wells.
to be sure I'm clear on what you're
Okay.
saying, John. We should shut down all development, all growth in this town, so that we don't use water that some people want to put on their lawns. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'm saying that you should know the safe yield of your groundwater withdrawal systems, and if additively you add development that exceeds that, you will eventually run out of water.
Do you know, John, what percentage of the water in the aquifer was recycled through people's lawns?
No, I don't. But I do know that when you add people, you subtract water. And take a town like Dover, for instance, which is exclusively on groundwater. If you're not recharging that groundwater and you're sending it directly into the river, then you're ultimately depleting your aquifer by adding more users. And that's all I'm pointing out. I'm saying you should know that number, because a lot of towns have faced that. And Medfield is unique in that the groundwater wells that we have service different parts of the town. So I guess what Randy is saying by saying that there's a water tower next to the hospital is that the water that will service the hospital will come from well number 6, because well 6 is the one on the Charles River near the hospital. But the other 5 wells aren't connected to that part of town. They service other parts of the town through Mount Nebo. So it's not as easy as we'll just turn some valves and we'll share the water all over
So,
town.
John, I'll say, I agree with you, we ought to know that number.
That's all I'm
The
saying.
last I had heard of this, and this was in a conversation with Mike Sullivan, was that there was a regulatory limit on our ability to withdraw water. There was not a geological limit on the amount of water in the aquifer. As I understand it,
That's not true.
the aquifer is
Unlimited?
not unlimited. No, of course it's not unlimited. If you put 150 million people there, yes, that would have a difference. But as I understood it, the physical limit on it is not so low that you'd actually ever approach it with anything on the table.
I don't think
That could be
that's-
wrong. It's a scientific question, right? And it should be answered by science and not by people's preferences on
Correct.
other issues as to what that fact is. And I would like to know what percentage of the water that ends up in the aquifer goes through people's lawns. Because I would bet it's a low percentage.
In the summertime, it's pretty high, because in the summertime, all the rainfall is used by plants. None of it goes into the ground. Our aquifer is replenished purely by winter snowfall.
And
saying that as
apparently,
a hydrologist.
apparently lawn watering.
Not
I
just,
would say the
yeah,
sump
well,
pumps
not
in my
lawn water.
basement
There's
would challenge
there's
that
no recharge in
observation.
the summer. There's no recharge in the summer. Recharge, the water year starts in October, and it runs into the spring, and it's snowfall. It's all driven by snowfall. It's not driven by thunderstorms in the summer. So it's just, you should know that number. no.
John, do you
What's
know
your
the
limit?
historic levels of our aquifer, whether we've been impacting it or not? Have we been measuring that, I guess? Is anybody keeping track of that? Because I had always thought that we had plenty of water too, although I do remember one summer that hearing that we had to be a little careful with well
Well-
6 because it had gone down some.
Pete, and I don't want to take up more of your time with this, but we share our watershed with other communities. Millis is drawing water off the same aquifer. So they're using more, we're using more, and DEP is trying to control the water withdrawal within the safe yield of the aquifer. But these blips in weather and climate are making it drier at times. We've had a wet year the last 12 to 15 months, but before that, it was very dry. So just try to understand that number as you consider more development in town.
Well,
Well, presumably though, like if you ever had to apply for an increase in our permit, I would assume that DEP would evaluate that as part of that process as well. I mean, right now, there's a regulatory limit.
That's
on what
right.
we can withdraw.
And I doubt they
I don't
would-
think it's,
Add to it.
I don't think that the regulatory limit bumps up right against the physical limit.
I think they're leaving a margin of safety, and I think if you asked for more, it would be very difficult to get more. I think you'd be looking at MWRA sources at that point.
So it seems like there'd be an opportunity at some point to evaluate what that number is.
Yeah, yeah, that's all I'm saying.
pass the
Microphone.
microphone off.
Just a comment, I'm not an expert on this, but in reading through all of our permits and getting myself up to speed on this board, somebody knows that number, and I would say the DEP knows that number, the DCRC knows that number, the Charles River Watershed Association knows that number. We also draw from the Neponset, and they have the same trio of regulatory authorities and concerned citizens looking after this. So, I mean, to John's point, it's important to know there's at least 3 organizations that I know of by reading the permits that look at this actively. And I would think that if we needed to increase our withdrawal limit, we'd probably have a lot of conversations to have just because there's so many stakeholders involved in managing these numbers. So it's something, there's a lot of people looking at it. So I wouldn't make that the top thing for you to go home and Google tonight, because I think you can rest assured a lot of people who will have a lot more knowledge than me are looking after this safe yield number.
Yeah, and the reason I push back so quickly is we're discussing on the 18th of November whether to do a zoning change to allow development. I think that's an interesting point that you're making for the long-range, ecological health of the town. I don't find it relevant at all for the discussion we have in 2 weeks about whether or not we're going to move ahead with the zoning. I actually think you don't really want to go there either, because if what we're concluding is we should have no development, given that I heard you make an eloquent case for preserving buildings, presumably we would preserve them to do something, so you threw me off a little bit, because you're making an argument for why we should take the buildings down. Huh?
Not residential.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Christian Donner, 92 Green Street. I was just curious because what I heard here didn't add up. On one hand, Mr.
Randy.
Said that there were summers where we were close to the regulatory limit on the withdrawal, right? How close?
I think we got within 5 or 10% one summer.
So if it was within 5%, and then we're adding 8 to 10% on the consumption side through the new development, then we would be over that limit. And so your response to that is, well, we just make everybody else use less water. And I think that's not going to go over well.
The other issue I think that factors into it is that we used to have a much higher unaccounted for water percentage, and now that we're down to 16%, we actually have more, we're actually not wasting as much water on an unaccounted basis, so that,
16%, 1/6 is just disappears.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we used to be up at 25% or more, I think.
Over
30.
30, yeah.
So Christian, a couple, and Randy, correct me on all this. The interesting thing I've come to learn, I think, about water is the water department, because it bases its entire budgeting and its rates around a projected demand. So it's like they're almost like a utility. We don't want to sell too much electricity because we'll have to put the high-cost generators online, but we don't want to sell too little because we want to sell electricity. The water department kind of wants to sell a steady amount of its total allowable water. And it doesn't want to see radical water conservation where demand drops by 30%, so it can't go over. The issue on the table, the question that I was asking, had to do with how big a deal is it that we have to be worried about exceeding our permitted capacity if we put a development up at the state hospital. The first pass answer to that is, I don't think it's a problem. The second pass on that is, if it were a problem, what we would do is we would put more restrictions on when people can water their lawn. It isn't even a matter we'd eliminate it. It would be that we would not allow them to water their lawn every day or every other day. We'd have to stretch that out. So that's how that would play out, I think.
Well, one other clarification, our withdrawal permit also, it has the volume we can withdraw as a permit, the unaccounted for water, 10% or less. So we were way over that. The state average for unaccounted for water across all municipalities is 13%. So at 16%, we are off the high profile list at the Department of Environmental Protection. There's a third one that we don't get even close to, and that's the residential per capita day use, which is 65 gallons per person per day. We run consistently between 70 and 75.
I thought Mo said we were down to 69. No?
Well, you know, I'm looking at historical data, but it's,
Okay.
we're over that, and I would assume that if we went to the state to increase our withdrawal volume, they'd say, just like you'd say to a teenager who's blown their entire allowance, until you treat this water resource in the way it's supposed to be treated, we're not gonna give you a new volume.
Yeah.
And that would be the justification to go back to our users and say, look, we can't have as much outdoor watering as we've allowed in the past because due to growth, and the whole area is gonna deal with this because, as John points out, it's a finite resource. So there's some other factors here that gets to be, it's not quite as simple as what you pump out of the ground.
Microphone, pass it back.
Just a point of information. Going back through some of the water records, I was struck by the fact that back in 2002 we were at 95% capacity, and that when DCAM started talking about the 440 units, the state asked the town where we thought we were going to get the water for that, and of course the hospital well field was immediately mentioned, which subsequently has proven, I guess, to be not available and not capable of producing.
The tubular well field.
Yeah, well, because we weren't going to use it as a tubular well field. It would have required revitalization. It would have required probably $1 million worth of investment to drill a modern well. But also, what I found interesting was at the time, this report that the town put out said that we had a 3% water loss in 2002. So again, I thought that was somewhat interesting. So right now, we're at close, I guess, on an average to our 1.5 million gallons per day is what I thought I heard at one of the meetings. So we're no? Over the year, for the whole year? No. I didn't say that. Well, I didn't say you said it, but I said I thought I heard that at the last water and sewer meeting. Now, granted, I had to get up early to go to that meeting, which I'm not used to, so perhaps my ears weren't awake yet. But I did hear that.
In the wintertime, we would draw about 30 million gallons for a month. Get the numbers right. Yeah, 30 million, and it goes up to about 20% or 70% in the summertime. So there's a big seasonal swing.
Yeah.
But we're close to our average what we're allowed to pump for the year.
And it sounds like the water department kind of wants to do that.
Now, again, I'm not saying that these numbers are cast in concrete, but after asking the consultant for 2 years what the water usage was in the preferred scenario, We didn't actually get anything until after the master plan was published, and we got numbers that were somewhere around 120 gallons per person per day. That number now, after the last PAR survey or whatever, came down a few gallons, and if I did my math right, we're somewhere around 100,000 gallons per person per day. Now, that's not to say that's what a developer is going to come in with, but on paper, that's a big problem.
Intuitively, that doesn't make sense to me, that you'd have concentrated housing and it would be more per person per day than what our normal, but
Well, this is why I asked the question 2 years ago and took 2 years to get an answer that's,
must be the
on the-
fountains, must be the fountains we're putting up there.
yeah, well, it's
All the
it's a
watering
new,
of the community gardens.
That's right.
it's a new Bellagio.
Yeah, I
So-
don't want, you know, I'm not
I
trying
just want to say,
yeah.
we have issues with the studies that were done to date on the water usage at the hospital, and DCAM's usage for the 440 units was 75 gallons per person per day, and they got a MEPA certificate for that with the stipulation that they get it down to 65 gallons per day. So there's some serious issues there.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted us all to be on the same sheet of music when it came to infrastructure. I think we are, for purposes of the development. Let's see, the next item we had was the request to sign the lease agreement with Quarry Road. Regarding-
License, it's actually license agreement, not lease.
Yeah, it is a license agreement. Correct. And we just need to sign it, we're to vote to sign it, okay?
He's already signed it?
He's already signed it, yep, it looked fine.
I would move to sign it.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, okay, done. And next item is request to authorize to sign the license agreement for filming, I guess Christine, you can fill us in, for the filming project at, yet another film project at Medfield State Hospital to help pay off the maintenance.
So I'm in the process of negotiating with a movie company to do a small 9-day filming at the Medfield State Hospital. We have the license agreement almost agreed upon. I already have their insurance certificates and their fee. They'll actually begin tomorrow, but we're just working out the last few items on the language. So if you can authorize me to sign it, we probably won't, because they're on LA time, won't get it done until about midnight tonight.
Mhm.
And I'm hoping we're done by then.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Yep.
Aye.
Thank you.
What's the fee, or is it not public?
It's not public yet.
Just as an aside, in the discussions that Christine and I had around this, it probably would help us to have a little bit of thought put into, this is a little bit of a unique requirement because the request was to use a couple of the buildings for filming on a nearly non-interfering basis. So in a weird sort of way where we've tended to always talk about leasing the site, and it happened to be on that big lease we had, they also wanted to use buildings to, in this case, people wanting to use the buildings and not put an excessive burden on the site. So maybe we ought to think about per building rates for leasing buildings. We have a lot of buildings for the time being that we could make available, and if they don't interrupt the site, it's not a major inconvenience for any of us. It's the first time that's come up, and maybe there's more opportunity for that kind of a facility to be used, and we recognize we ought to encourage it.
It would be good to figure out what the market is for this stuff. I mean, I think we're a little bit just picking numbers blindly, because we're not experts at this. And there's got to be people who have better expertise than we do. I mean, Chris has done probably more of these now than most people. But still, I mean, the Globe had an article about Acorn Street, and I think that rented for $3,000, or was it 10? I don't remember what it was. It was a lot of money for a little private street on Beacon Hill.
Well,
Pete,
the State Film Board tries to get involved and
Yeah.
keep a lid on what you're charging too.
Yeah, because they have a different interest than we do.
Right, exactly.
Well, I'm actually suggesting that if we were thoughtful about it, it may be to make it an attractive facility, from a pricing standpoint, if we made it an attractive facility and more people were interested in using it. It's not so much trying to drive the price up, it's trying, to your point, it'd be nice to know kind of what the market, what a reasonable price is, rather than throwing darts at a wall, which is sort of what we've done.
Gus,
Although they,
it's-
the movie companies tell us quickly what their market is, we lost one recently because they were able to get a better deal somewhere else, so that does become evident.
I think
but-
there's also the issue with regard to the film tax credits in different places.
Yes.
I mean, they went to Canada,
Yep.
the Canadians may have a way better reimbursement rate than Massachusetts.
Right, and they're
does.
not negotiating with just us, they're negotiating with the Mass Film Office as well. So in that case, they weren't able to strike a deal with them.
Right. Just incidentally, Christine and I field several of these inquiries a year that you don't even hear about because, you know, they'll look at the site and they'll assess what their needs are. So they're looking for, you know, a specific stairway or a specific road or some, you know, they have unique needs for filming, but sometimes, as in this case, something strikes them in the buildings that they like, and the side benefit of that is that they do work in the buildings. They're going to clean a building for us as part of this, and so we get some additional financial benefit for the work that they do on the grounds as well. So I think it's a great use, and I'm sure that we'll get a lot more inquiries to use the property for filming for a while.
It's also the economic multiplier of having them in town.
Yeah.
Once they're up there, then they start buying lunch and coffee around town, which is great for our businesses as well.
Right. Okay. Next, Selectmen are requested to authorize town administrator to sign the license, I'm sorry, we just did that. Request from John Thompson to approve expenditure of, so you're up,
Easy come, easy go.
right?
So I have,
Here's a mic.
I don't have it in front of me. Christina, did you
They
circulate?
should
to
have
the-
a,
got
they
it.
should have a copy.
Okay, so,
Yep.
so the expenditure you have in front of you, and I'm John Thompson, the chairman of the Buildings and Grounds for the State Hospital. The expenditure before you is to get a roofing contractor who had bid and won a bid with the town to do work on the roofs at the hospital. And this is work to, it's not improvement work. It's work to really, you know, fix active leaks and things that will ultimately get worse and cause more cost to fix. And these are not at the level that they're, you know, the roof is caving in or anything, but they are things that we need to keep up on. And I think we need to continue to, you know, work on the roofs. It's a good value, and work on masonry and continue to put boards up. Some of this work is to replace boards that fell off. Boards fall off, rocks get thrown at glass, and then it's just more work, and it's more of a safety concern. So some of what you have in front of you is to do some boarding, probably do some small masonry work, and also fix some of the leaks in the rooftops. But we haven't spent money on roofs in a couple of years now, and the work that I did 2 years ago on several of the buildings is still fantastic. If there's a bigger area that leaks, we use EDPM, which is the sheet rubber. We don't go and put in like 200 new slates in. We just cover it with EDPM, and they have buttons that they can put into the roof to hold it down. So there are ways to do it economically, and I've been impressed with how long these repairs last once we do them. So that's what you have in front of you.
Questions?
How much of this amount is for the chapel versus the other two buildings?
Some, I don't know, you know, it's probably maybe 1/5 of that, Mike. It's not a lot, but the chapel, there's one part of the roof on the west side of the chapel that what the water is doing is running down, and when it freezes, it's causing a problem with the bricks in the soffit line, and that's causing water to get on the inside and starting to sheave some of the plaster on the inside. So it's not a big fix to do that, but if we don't fix it, some of the brickwork on the west side will actually fall out of the soffit line. So I think it's worth doing that, and I don't think that we should wait until, you know, Gene's capabilities under a grant and so forth pick up. I think we should do this work now while we can, so that they can at least be stabilized, until that can be picked up under her grant money and budget.
And what do you foresee for roof and maintenance and repair work coming down the road? Is there stuff in the pipeline that you'll see this is gonna have to happen in the next 2 years, or is it just gonna be,
Yeah.
we don't know when something's gonna happen, we might have
No,
to
I
address it?
think there's enough here that we should always carry some sort of budget for working on roofs. What happens is with wind, it peels off the ridge caps, which are the beautiful copper flashing that's on the ridges and on the coming down the ridges. Sometimes we get these high winds like we had last week. That stuff peels back. And it's a lot easier to go up and just pin that copper flashing back up than to let it blow off the roof and allow water to start going in. So I think we're always, they carried a budget of almost $20,000 for roof work in 1922, just for routine maintenance on the rooftops at the hospital. And I don't think we probably even need to spend that much, but if we keep picking away at it, it will start to dwindle, the amount of work we need to do to catch up. Remember, the state left some of these buildings in the 1970s. They didn't do much work on them.
Christine, where do we stand on the revolving fund?
I'd have to look, we just processed a bunch of bills, but I think we have close to 150 is our,
170 a
170.
couple weeks ago.
yeah. So I think we're probably around 150. We just had some summer landscaping bills come in, so we're probably around 150.
I think it's a good idea.
So I have several questions. How do you, what constitute, how do you, they're old buildings, so there's some things, how do you figure out which of these what constitute, let me start. Are these emergency repairs?
No, they're not emergency repairs, but what constitutes, or what puts it on the runway, and what I would show to a contractor like Caffrey is when I go into an attic and I see the need to physically put a 5-gallon bucket under a valley because the water is actively showering in.
Okay.
That's really what it is, Gus.
Okay.
And then there's one building that if I see a lot of daylight in a broad area, then that's another area
Okay.
that I would
So
look at.
you're trying to nip problems in the bud?
Absolutely. And the beams in the attic, the rafters are excellent. And I've gone in with the architects that looked at the buildings for Gene. And they agree that, if you can stop these valley leaks for short money, the architects can easily repair and bring them back up to code, really, without a lot of effort. But if you let them go, then, of course, it weakens the whole structure. Yeah. But none of these are emergency work.
And having gone through the contract here, now the thing I saw here, which is Skip Caffrey, this is a proposal.
Yes.
What form does our task orders take? Like, in other words, there's a basic contract that says we'll issue task orders. I don't see a task order.
Yeah.
I only see a proposal.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, from an administration standpoint,
That would come
What
from
happens?
the bid proposal, I guess, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, so they already bid what their time and materials would be.
Yeah.
And this is what Doug and I were talking about, is that we need a full list of what they're going to be doing. This kind of leaves it open-ended as to they'll see what happens when they get up there.
Yeah.
But they need an actual list of what they're doing at each building.
Yeah.
so if that's the case, what I'm trying to figure out is you're spotting problems, say, here's the problem we want you to fix.
Yeah.
This is a proposal, but if it's coming
Right.
in saying, well, we'll just go up there and look around, it's like something's not
Well,
connecting for me.
the
problem
problem
is the
with
lift.
that is, the lift is, well, I don't know, $3,000 or $4,000 a
It's
week.
10,000 to the 28,000.
Yeah, it's a lot for the
Yeah, for
lift.
two
The
of them.
big chunk of it is the lift.
Mhm.
And they really can't see the full scope because the buildings are 50 to 60 feet high. So to go in the attic and look is one thing, but really they need to get up and see what's going on the outside to determine the real, like how many hours they're going to spend on that. So if you have any ideas on like how we could ask them to task it, I'm open to suggestions. It's just that what they tell me is, yeah, you showed me the leak from the inside. But when I get up on the lift on the outside, it may be twice as much work than what you showed me on the inside. Because on the inside, all you see is water
Right.
in a corner. They don't really know how far up the flashing
Okay,
needs
yeah,
to be
okay.
fixed.
So the and I'm coming from a standpoint of having done contract management.
Yeah,
Where when someone says, well, here's a price, we'll have to get up there to figure out what needs to be
Yeah.
done. I'm sitting there, something's not adding up here, either the
Right.
price is too high, which
Yeah.
is usually what happens.
yeah,
On the other hand, it's under 30,000, so it's not like a $350,000
Yeah.
contract, so I'm not that worked up about that per se. How often have we had lifts come in like this? I mean, I'm looking at
Well-
10,000 out of a $30,000 contract is a lot.
it's,
How often do we do that?
well, I haven't done it in 2 years.
Okay.
We did it with Titan Roofing a couple of years ago. We did
Okay.
work on the chapel, and we replaced a lot of the boards.
Mhm.
And I suppose, would you buy a lift, or is there another way to get a lift available? Because the issue with lifts are they're very expensive, and there's a lot of safety requirements that go around the men that can actually go into a lift.
Mhm.
And that's why it's expensive, even for the contracting company, because they need to have a lot of training to go. Lifts are high
Okay, all right.
safety concerns, so,
Let me leave that. You've been doing it, you know when to bring it
yeah,
up.
I've watched them do it.
And
yeah.
it's, I looked at that and I combined it with, well, we're gonna go up there, we're gonna look around, we'll tell you what it takes, and I'm sitting there, why don't you just get a ladder, you know?
Yeah, yeah, no,
And, it's kinda like it feels real wishy-washy relative
Yeah.
to the price, that's what I'm
It's a
reacting
very
to.
difficult thing to see because, even looking at work around where the chimneys meet the roofs, I mean, you're up almost 100 feet in the air.
So let me try asking the question a different way. What's the risk that they're gonna go up there and look at this and say, oh, it's not 28,000, it's 45,000?
Well, I would know that before they do any of that, and then I guess I would have to come back. If I felt it was an emergency, then that would be we'd have to take a different approach. But it's unlikely that they'll see something like that. Based on what we've looked at,
Yeah.
these are things that are,
So
basically
let me
gonna
keep
fit
going.
in there.
So what I'm getting at is they gave a price. I think this price is to do the work,
yeah,
except there's this disclaimer that says, well, we need to get up there and look at it, and then we'll let you know what it is.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm asking the question is somewhere in here, they came up with an estimate of the price without having
Right.
gone up to look.
right,
Had they said, listen, we may get up there and discover it's a bigger problem than we thought, so we
Yeah.
reserve the right to come back, that language I would have understood.
yeah, yeah.
This language just rang an alarm bell with me because it felt really wishy-washy.
Yeah, it's really the unknowns with working at height like that.
Right.
That's why it's like that. But
Right.
I would think that this estimate is somewhere within, for the work on the 4 or 5 buildings that this includes, is somewhere within what the means engineering estimate would be,
Okay.
which is 25% contingency on the
Okay,
work.
all right. I want to have a conversation, I'm going to listen to these two around this. And partly this is yet one more thing that's flowing into my head around looking ahead to the special town meeting, understanding there's controversy. And one way we go down the path that we thought we were going to go down, the other way, we get a rejection of the path. And so where I've been going with my head is I'm trying to handicap, all right, if that happens, where do we go next? The repairs to the chapel, just so you both hear this, I am supportive of us doing what it takes to keep the chapel in as absolutely good a shape as we can for whatever portion of the next 5 years Jean needs to get to the point where she's prepared to take over or the CAM is prepared to take over. We said we want this to succeed, and the discussions of the lease, we want this to succeed, allowing the building to deteriorate because we have a commitment at some point to renovate that. It just makes sense to me that we keep that all together, so I'm on board with that. I will possibly be on board with the other 2 buildings after the 18th of November. And that all depends on where we come out on the 18th of November. If we come out with Plan A is not accepted, that's okay. But then we have to think about where we're going, and I'm not particularly on board with maintaining buildings in the face of a vote that says, no, we really don't want you to go develop something.
Well,
So-
Gus,
so-
I think you have a fiduciary responsibility to prevent or minimize the cost to the taxpayers in the future. So-
Well,
so
I agree with
the
that.
maintenance of-
I agree with you.
So
I'm
that
saying
includes other buildings besides the
not
chapel.
automatically maintaining those buildings. What I'm getting at is, at the end, after the 18th of November, the town meeting vote will tell us which way we're going. If we're going down the path that we're, asking to go down, then absolutely, we've got to maintain the buildings. If we're not going down that path, we have to figure out what we're gonna do instead.
So are you saying we're not going to maintain the buildings if the vote doesn't
I am
pass on the
saying
18th?
if we're not going down that
Make it clear.
path, we need to figure out what we're gonna do instead. And that doesn't automatically.
Does that mean not fulfilling your obligation to maintain the
No,
property?
it means we need to figure out what we're gonna do instead. So we need to understand that vote, we need to understand the fallout of that vote. There are people who say, mow it down and get us green space.
Well, I think
That's
we'll
one
do,
voice.
I think we
And
should,
I don't, John, I
think
don't
we
wanna
should do
get
what
into.
the
I don't
taxpayers
wanna
want
get
us
into-
to do,
I
shouldn't
don't
we?
wanna get into that discussion here, because I'm not able to. I'm saying, I don't necessarily wanna commit money to maintaining a building until we know that's actually
well,
something.
why don't we let the taxpayers decide that?
That's exactly right, in 2 weeks.
Well, I think to your point, Gus, though.
And I said I'd listen to these too, so but I want to put that on the table.
Right, no, I think, look, I don't think there's any, I mean, you said it's not an emergency, so if you waited 2 weeks to deal with this, there's no, right, there's no harm in waiting 2 weeks. I mean, I think, to your point, Gus, is if the answer is no on the 18th, depending on the proceedings, you may say, well, look, we're gonna have to identify what we're gonna do with the buildings. How are we gonna mitigate the risk of the buildings? And part of the question of maintaining or not maintaining is gonna be which of the buildings are in best shape, which are in the worst shape, which are likely to have the most value for redevelopment, since, in my view, if there's a no vote on the 18th, that means we're not preserving the campus long-term. We're gonna preserve some of it that makes sense or what have you.
We're not
but it's
preserving it in its entirety.
It's entirety, right. And so, in other words, if you're gonna fix a roof on the buildings that's the worst shape, that doesn't make any sense, right? Because we'll have to develop an alternative plan that might say, look, here's how we're gonna take the 3 buildings that are in the worst shape, and rather than maintain them, we're gonna take them down in the next 18 months, right? Or it could be a yes vote on the 18th, we'll say, look, we gotta keep this in shape for at least the next year to see what happens. Or it could be a no vote with the guidance that's different, right? And so I think it's the uncertainty about where we're gonna be that says, let's not commit the money right now, just because we have a rather significant milestone occurring 13 days from now. And that makes sense to me. I think in general, as long as the buildings are, for the buildings that are in usable shape, my general preference would be, even if there's a no vote, to keep them up. Because I think then, they can last for a while, and 15 years from now, somebody may come along with something that would work. But I hear your point, so I'm fine deferring this until
I guess my concern, Mike, with that is that for buildings, you're saying that we don't know what we're going to do with the property, therefore, we should ignore the responsibility to keep the buildings in whatever condition they're in some form that they're maintained and mothballed and stabilized. And that's a recipe for demolition by neglect. Because
That's not what I said at all.
you're no longer
what I said.
maintaining the property in a way that keeps it for, or mothballs it for whatever future use those buildings are used, whatever they're used for in the future.
Yeah, no, that's the opposite of what I said. So,
Okay, I'm not sure I understood.
What I said was, I don't know what we're gonna do with it. It may well be that our fiduciary duty is to the town of Medfield. We do not have a fiduciary duty to the 32 buildings on Medfield State Hospital property. We don't owe those buildings any obligation whatsoever. And so, we all have to decide what's in the best interest of the town to do with those buildings, right? It may well be that we're gonna say, look, for a 2-year period, we're gonna keep everything status quo while we work on Plan B. It may well be, we look at it and say, you know what, for these 3 buildings, let's develop a plan, Nick, go off and let's develop a plan to put out to bid something to take those 3 buildings down, because they're in the worst shape, and it'll be cheaper for the town in the long run and more beneficial to the town in the long to take those down. I don't know the answer to that.
Right.
And so, I think all we're talking about here is, well, let's wait 13 days, 14 days. It's not a decision to say we're gonna let them fall apart. I don't think any of us are talking about demolition by neglect. I don't think any of us is saying we're just gonna, let them fall apart. But I think there's an open question that will be either open or closed on the 19th that we'll have to resolve. And this may play into it. And look, this is $28,000, right? Most likely, no matter what happens on the 18th, we're gonna come back and say, well, it makes sense to take your advice and address the most immediate needs that you've identified, which are these, because it may take us 6 months or 9 months or a year to sort out what the next step is. So it's not saying, well, if the vote is no on the 18th, we're just gonna ignore.
Right.
But that certainly would be, to me, a pretty resounding statement, depending on the margin, that preservation of the entire campus is not an important objective for the town.
Anything to add?
Well, it's just sort of a reiteration of the same things, which is that if the zoning fails, then we're into a territory that's uncertain, and that we just have a lot of issues that we haven't already thought about, that we are gonna have to think about very seriously at that point. So I think that, once, if that's what happens, then we have to come up with and address that issue. And, John's come up with a proposal to mothball the campus, and there's a cost for that, and maybe that would go to the town meeting, and, who knows what would happen at that point. But we're not there, and so that we're not working on that.
Right, this could be rolled into a broader program.
Sure.
Rather
No,
than
understood.
we're sort of in a situation where we do one-offs.
Yeah.
Whereas it would be rolled into something that's sort of a more sustained, something akin to what we've done with our municipal buildings in the past couple of years, so.
Okay.
So does it make sense to defer this? You get to weigh in here. If you're saying there's some emergency that we would be derelict waiting until our next meeting, but I'd suggest we defer this until our next meeting.
No, there isn't, none of it is emergency work
Okay,
at this point.
okay. Then why don't we just do that? Okay,
Put this on the
great.
agenda for the 19th, or we're not gonna meet the 19th.
I don't think we're planning on meeting on the 19th, depending on how we go to the
Third.
18th, but it'll be on the first meeting.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Gus, on your agenda, were you having us talk about the letter with DCAM?
Yeah, it might make
Yeah.
sense to have.
Does that flow into
Yeah,
this?
if you want to stay,
Okay,
yeah, why don't we jump
I'll
to
stay
that?
up if,
Because actually I have more
if,
comments on that one as
do
well,
that.
so, sure.
We've been actually doing edits up until about an hour ago.
Yep.
So the latest draft, and I will send the latest draft down to you all. There's actually some changes to this draft as well. And Peg Stolpa, who's drafted the letter for us, is here as well.
CC's on the other one.
Yeah, got it. Hold on. Get to that letter. That one. Where did I put that one?
they would do it right away.
I hate it when I do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to talk to the contractor.
Oh, there it is.
I know. Not bad.
These main changes are just the ones that had to do with the comments that you got back from the draft you sent out, Christine?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Okay. you. Comments?
I had 2 commas to insert in paragraph on page 1.
I'm all right with the way it is.
So you all have figured out by now, I'm the joker in the deck, especially at tonight's meeting, because I have a more fundamental question for all of you. Why are we worried about giving DCAM an extension on this easement at all? They have an easement. They failed to act on 5 years of an easement. They have a road that they can get there. That road's not going anywhere for the next year or two. Why are we even giving them anything at all? We'll just say you can use the road until we tell you can't use the road, and if we anticipate you can't use the road, we'll give you some advance warning, and then you can figure out what to do. You know what the pressure is. We can tell you that we're not going to be doing anything to that road for a year.
It's on.
It's on. Oh, it's on.
Yeah, it's only the TV that hears you.
My name is Peg Stolf. I'm an environmental attorney. I think that one thing we've been struggling with DCAM is getting them to be proactive with us in addressing the concerns we have with respect to their lack of maintenance of the overlook and their the fact that they haven't finished the laundry parcel yet. So our hope was if we give them the extension in formal way that they wanted it done through an easement, a recorded easement, but with some conditions that get them back to the table and take some of the more objectionable changes that they want to propose right now off the table, that we might make more progress with them, both in maintaining and repairing the overlook, which if you were there at the 2015, it looked great. But they didn't maintain it effectively, and in fact, because there are now trees growing out of the top, that could actually be a big problem for the integrity of the cap. So we really need them to take control of that and make a significant improvements soon rather than later. And we've been having trouble getting them to re-engage. So this is kind of our one tool to be able to say to them, yeah, we want to give you this extension too, but we don't want you to build a road through the river road that people now bike and hike on, right through the wetland. And we want you to come meet with us, talk to us. It may be too much to have 3 conditions here. Maybe we wrap it into the first 2 because, if we're meeting with them, we're getting them to the table to talk about implementing the overlook plan. So maybe we take that out to not be quite so overhanded, but we're really not getting them
I don't have a
back to the
problem
table
with the 3
otherwise.
conditions if we go
Okay.
down this route. I'm not arguing for reducing conditions. So I understand what you're saying. I agree with the strategy of using this as leverage. My question here is the same question I asked John. Is there any reason why we need to do this before the 18th of November?
The timing is that the current easement expires in early December.
December.
And
End of December, right?
No, it's the 1st of December.
well, it's the date of recording, and
So
we
the
Recording
4th.
was the 2nd of December, I'm assuming it would expire.
well we signed it yeah.
I
So
think we signed it the 2nd. I think it's actually recorded on the 4th.
yeah, so it's very early. It's less than a month now. It takes a while to get things moving, and because they've already invested a lot in their feasibility study under which they're selecting the river road, if we say no, they'll just say, fine, we're just going to do the river road, and then we got to deal with them in
Yeah, I'm not
Conservation
saying,
Commission.
well, so that's one reason to not say no. Again,
So we could wait.
I'm handicapping post-18 November,
Yeah, I
and
hear
I'm
you.
handicapping both scenarios.
Sure.
And I had assumed that the river road, in the discussions we had when they were out here, the river road, it appeared there was a pretty strong coalition that was against converting the river road. I read through the entire analysis, I get it, and I read an extremely strong economic argument for doing it on the river road on both ecological and financial grounds, unless there's enough of a constituency against doing that to block the state. So it almost, I agree with what you're trying to do here in terms of the engagement. But as I handicap that analysis, I'm saying unless there's a way to politically block them, they're doing the river road.
Well, there are all the stakeholders oppose the river road. So
Oh.
Charles River Watershed trustees,
Right,
the town.
right.
So I think that, assuming those groups are as successful as we were last time in forcing them to the table, we'll get there. Took how many years of mediation to make this much progress. It would be better, I think, for everyone if we could get them back to the table now to say, don't do the River Road and make everyone frustrated and angry with you. Come to the table and talk with us about how to do this in a different way, where we may not, we don't need to make that decision right now if we have these other things to tackle and we work on it with them together. The feasibility analysis that they did had enough factual errors about the site itself that I question the validity of some of their assumptions. I don't have the data that they behind some of their numbers, and so I didn't give it as much weight. I mean, clearly they wanted that road as the easiest one to get in. The town had suggested another option, and they didn't. The one they considered as their option 1A, I think they attribute to the town, but it's not actually the proposal the town had given them as a suggestion. So things like that kind of make me question other underlying facts and mistakes they made about the site itself in their own analysis. So I think that, the town made really good progress with them previously and got a lot of great cleanup and redevelopment, restoration of the resource up there. As staff changed up there and things were going well, it kind of fell off. So now it's a whole new staff that I think are, they're all reasonable people. I think they'll work with us if we give them a reason to. But I think the more they spend on their River Road, the harder it's going to be to pull them back to the table to talk with us about these open issues that are that will affect the marketability of that property ultimately too. If the Overlook continues to be a weed farm, it's not going to be the attractive resource that it could be or that it was. It still has the potential for.
What's the harm in just telling them without actually going through this full easement agreement, we just say, listen, the road you're using, you have free access to. It's going to be there for a year. We don't need to formalize any agreement around easements that could constrain what we do. You just have it for another year. We would like to have these things happen. If these things happen and you demonstrate I'm looking for leverage too here, just to
Sure,
be
yeah,
clear.
no, I hear you.
And you demonstrate your commitment to fulfilling the obligations that you committed to when you built the Overlook. At the point that we see the relationships have been restored, we see you doing what you're supposed to be doing out at the Overlook, and I'm not even dealing with the cleanup on the site, because I have some grasp of what might be the technical difficulties of that. When we see you performing in accordance with what you agreed to under the last easement, we will be happy to discuss a new easement. And in the meantime, as a practical matter, you can keep doing what you're doing. We can tell you that the road's not going anywhere. The road's not going to be closed. So as you're working to fulfill your obligations, once we see good faith that you mean it, then we'll sit down and negotiate and we'll have a discussion around easements with you.
What do they use the easement for?
Apparently nothing right now.
well,
What should they be using it for?
Access to the Overlook.
Access to the Overlook.
It just doesn't sound like a great leverage point. If they're already not using it to clean up the Overlook, now we're going to say you're not allowed to go over to clean up
No,
the
they
Overlook.
are. No, they are.
They
The road's
do.
there.
The
The road
pub-
is
yeah.
there.
Yeah, right now, the
Public access to the Overlook as well. So we're allowing the public to go over our existing roadway to get to the
Yeah.
Overlook in the back.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'd be arresting the people walking over there.
No, it's our obligation to
Right.
leave it open, yeah.
Right.
And our intention
I'm
is to
just,
do
I'm just
that.
questioning, guys,
Yeah.
whether withdrawing this easement is really going to strike terror into the hearts of
Well,
DCAM when it sounds like they're not even using it now.
and so the theory
Well,
is.
no, well-
I kinda think that the-
Well, let's
so-
go
so
there.
there's-
Let's
there's-
go
I'm
there.
sorry.
Let's go there.
There-
So granting the easement is going to cause them to be any more cooperative and responsive than what they've been for the last 5 years?
well,
Yeah, I'm
So,
looking for
so this is,
something.
Gus, this is a
Well-
neighbor dispute, and basically, we don't have any
No.
legal leverage over them.
No,
so
no, no, no.
we're trying to find whatever leverage
So that
we
what we're
can.
trying to do is,
Well,
we're
so
trying
am
to be
I.
nice,
So am
and
I.
we're trying to
We could do it with just a letter.
start the discussion and
Yeah.
get things moving with
If
them.
you want to start the
We're not
discussion,
really
that's
giving-
okay.
we're not really giving up
Can you all
anything,
hear what
Gus.
I'm saying?
Yeah.
I do
All
hear what
right,
you're saying.
I'm not disagreeing with them ever getting it. I'm saying we're not seeing a damn thing from these folks. They don't even fulfill their current obligations. And yet what we're gonna do is have a negotiation to give you another year with 2 more years of extension because that's gonna give us leverage. I don't get it.
DCAM didn't have to give us what they gave us in the first instance with the whole cleanup. It was only because of the fact
I
that.
could care-
that
They made a commitment. They haven't followed the commitment.
Yeah, we had to pretty
Well,
much
right.
fight
And
for
so
that,
but they didn't have to give us anything they didn't have to go along with that bill. That's true. And so that it was only because of the fact that there was a long process that they engaged in with the town, that they did something. They spent a lot of money on it. And
So
so
there-
it
one
strikes me
second.
that this is a way to try to re-engage them. I mean, that's the issue, is you
Yeah,
want to get
and-
them
I'm
talking to us.
delighted to re-engage
And we
them.
could do that with just a letter promising, we'll let you continue to use this. Don't go forward with the River Road so that we can work on things with you. You know, probably they'll go ahead with the River Road and we'll deal with them in Conservation Commission. They still haven't transferred the property to DCR. That's what they're supposed to do. DCR, is silent. So you're right. It's hard to get them to engage in any productive way. This is as much to stop them from dragging us through the Conservation Commission process, where they'll face the same opposition they did before, and it's like a repeating that old process.
All I'm saying is, I'm looking at 5 years of performance, and they did a wonderful thing in creating the overlook. And then they have a changeover in responsibility, and they just turn their back on the responsibility. I'm not saying break things down, I'm not saying, you turn this into the Hatfields and McCoys. I'm saying this, to me, without interfering in anything practical that they would do, by withholding the easement until there's some demonstration of good faith that they're gonna fulfill the obligations they already have, we will set it up to where there's absolutely no barriers, but before we commit the town to binding ourselves, when they bound themselves and didn't deliver, why don't we basically say, listen, we want to be friendly, we want to work with you, we want to negotiate with you, and we're looking for some evidence of good faith on your part after evidence of non-good faith for several years to do this. And as soon as that happens, the sun will come out and we're going to be great partners with you as we have been in the past.
So here's my question, Gus. Since you said you are okay with the conditions in the letter, I mean,
Yeah.
what are they going to be conditions for if we're not offering to extend the easement if they meet the conditions?
These are the things we would like to see before we enter into a discussion around easement.
Well, that's what we're kind of saying.
Go ahead. Bill's
It
got
says we're
something.
willing to extend the easement if they do these 3 things.
Is that how it's?
That's how it says. We're willing to extend the temporary easement for a
Yeah,
period of
but
1 year
this is not a do it first before we do it. This
with
is
the
if you-
following conditions, which I read to mean if you do these 3 things, we'll give you the easement.
Right, so take
Yeah.
the River Road off the table completely,
Right.
reestablish our meetings and do it quarterly
Mhm.
to deal with these issues, then you have the extension. And we haven't drafted an extension. We did,
If
the
what
1
you're,
year and 2 is sort of in there just so that there's a discussion point for us to figure out what we really want to say to them.
if what you're telling me is we do not intend to sign an extension until they have performed,
Right.
that's the only thing I'm saying. If
Yeah.
that's what you really intended
Right.
here,
That's what the letter says.
Right, so I think we would want a
No,
letter from the
it-
commissioner
not-
saying, we tabled it.
this
River
is very
Road,
clear.
We're
Okay,
meeting with you,
okay,
we set up a calendar, here are the people.
we're good.
We want the commissioner to respond to Christine, we don't want her to shove it down to the lowest
Right.
person on the totem pole.
Okay. Bill, is that what you were trying to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that's the reason to try to get this done as quickly as possible, so she has time to review it and respond to us before it expires. I mean, that would be in our best interest. The other thing I wanted to say was, we should not lose sight of the fact that the laundry parcel has not been cleaned. I would work very hard not to give them any excuse to say the reason we're not back there working on the laundry parcel is because you didn't give us the access, and it's going to take us 2 years to build the River Road and all the rest of that stuff.
I was never saying block them.
But-
I was just saying, don't bind the town to an easement with partners who don't fulfill their side of the bargain.
And by the way, regardless of how I feel about the preferred scenario, the financial model, when it did its analysis of the net operating income for a developer per the plan, if you don't get that laundry parcel into the package that winds up with the developer, he loses something in the neighborhood of about 20% of his net operating income, because that is scheduled for a luxury condo building, the laundry parcel.
Bill, I think I've heard you say you don't think they'll ever clean that up, though.
Well, that is another issue, but
Right.
but we can't give them, we can't help them build their excuse for not getting it done. Now, one of the other things we might look at is what the standard is that we're holding it to there, too. And that's,
Yeah, I mean, technically, under the cleanup standards, they could close it today. But we negotiated a better deal. So now they can't close it until they can do it without any conditions, so that it can be any residential use there. So that's why they're not done yet. They do have a proposal we haven't seen yet to do another round of remediation out there. And when we get that, John will review it.
Peg, is that there was something in the materials that came across in front of us, that something about digging this stuff up and blanding or something, what's it
Yep,
called?
they're gonna blend it with some, are they using permanganate?
Yeah.
still viable.
An oxidizer.
Um,
So
it's
they've
an
come up with a new
oxidus-
solution at this point?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, part of their problem, Pete, is delivery to where the oxidizer needs to get in the ground, because you have clay and sand, and it's hard to get
Well, they just can't get the
liquids
oxygen there, huh?
into clay, where it'll go in the sand preferentially, but you can't force it into the clay. So because those soils are low permeability, basically they've decided it's better for them to dig it up and mix it, physically mix it, than
Then
to
put it
try to
back,
push it
okay.
into the more lower permeability
The
layers.
last approach was just find the hot spots and pull the hot spots. It's the last piece of
Yeah.
artificial paper that we got.
I'll just throw in a quick quip here. I oversaw, was part of a group of selectmen and oversaw the Superfund cleanup down the Cape. And the state government did exactly this, drag their feet. So we turned it over to the Safe Drinking Water Act and got the federal government involved, and things changed dramatically. At the early meetings, I mentioned that to the state people, that we can just as easily turn this over to a federal mandate under the Safe Drinking Water Act and get this done the correct way. It was after that meeting that they were all of a sudden, well, I think we can help you out. I think we can get things done. So for the state not to finish what they promised us to do is abhorrent, and to think that they gave us anything is absolutely wrong. We absolutely put them to their backs to the wall in regard to the federal government taking over this cleanup of this site, because it is under safe drinking water. There is a well within the area, and so we need to remind them that we would like them to clean it up, because otherwise we'll have to go to perhaps Safe Drinking Water Act in order to get it finished. On a humorous note, is the road we're talking about, is it a toll road that we're charging the state to use?
Not yet.
good idea.
So let me just summarize. So first off, to your point of what this letter said, the way I read the letter, it said, well, you commit to this and we'll give the easement, and that did not necessarily clearly state a sequential set of actions. In our discussion here, what I'm hearing is we're saying, no, it's a sequential state of actions. When this is restored, we can tell you we're not going to block you from doing anything right now without the easement. We can tell you that we're willing to negotiate the easement once these actions are taken. But as long as we're really clear about that, then I'm absolutely on board with the letter, and I don't care when it goes out.
We can clarify, that's a good point,
Okay.
just to make sure that's up front.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right.
How's that?
I'm all set.
Okay, one,
We need to move to,
You need to authorize me to
Yeah.
sign it.
So moved.
Second.
all those in favor?
Aye.
and one last piece of business for me was I spoke at the Selectmen's Meeting a month or so ago around certain parcels in town that were open space fields that weren't being maintained. We had, the issue with the farmer, and so I had a series of meetings with Bobby Kennedy in Public Works, and I've come up with a list. It's not a long list, but I want to give you the list of the parcels that we agreed were the ones that, if the town were to let a bid out for some sort of ongoing mowing and so forth, these would be the parcels. And the parcels are certain parts of the Holmquist land that were mowed. I think they called it the Boy Scout lot or something. I have the actual parcel numbers here for you.
This is beyond the agenda.
Okay.
Oh, it is, okay, if it's beyond the agenda.
Is there any action, or it's just information?
It's not actionable, it's just information, yeah. I'm not asking to take any action, I'm just providing the information subsequent. I can give it to Evelyn,
Why
Christine.
don't you do that?
It's simply a list of the parcels.
And John, thanks for both flagging
Sure.
the issue, and
Sure.
if you've done that legwork, that's.
Bobby and I came up with.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see, where are we next? Selectmen requested to vote to appoint Highway Supervisor Bob Kennedy to the Norfolk County Advisory Board.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Yep.
Aye.
Okay. Next one is the request to issue cell tower RFP for Mount Nebo, Medfield State Hospital Water Tower.
It's two separate locations.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah,
Towers.
Why did we,
you're doing an RFP for each site.
the only thing I saw was the Mount Nebo antenna lease, though.
They should both be in there, they're exactly the same. They should have both been in there.
Okay, maybe-
So there's one, the Mount Nebo lease refers to Hospital Road, which I think has got to be a mistake, so if somebody could just check that, and I would otherwise move to issue them.
Yeah, can I ask just a couple of questions before you
Sure.
vote? This is just information. I guess this would be the Mount Nebo Tower. The current, we have specified a certain amount, minimum they have to
Yes.
bid. What is that relative to the current lease terms?
Currently,
Is it higher? Did we bump it up?
it's
or-
slightly higher.
Slightly higher, so it's
Yes.
kind of consistent maybe with that 2.5% increase or something like that.
Yes, and Dave Maxon's been working with Nick and Mark on this, and Dave is aware of what is currently being offered in the market and suggested that price.
Okay, and then the only other question, I didn't print it all out, but on the lease, who determines the acceptability of so we have multiple installations. The awards are done in a sequence, and it says it sounds like until we don't have any more room for another installation.
There aren't that many carriers out there anymore.
So it's not an issue?
Probably
Because
not.
what I was getting at mechanically, the way it said is, until there's not room for another
Right. I mean,
installation. My
at
question
one
was,
time, there
who
were
makes that
half a dozen.
determination? Because if I were the first one on the tower,
Right.
I would claim, no, it's interfering with me, I don't think you can put anybody else there, so how does that get?
No,
controlled?
there's accepted standards. I think it's like 10 feet vertically and 10 feet horizontally. So you can get them fairly
Okay.
close, but there just aren't
Okay.
that many carriers out there anymore.
Okay,
But we're anticipating 3 to come back on this.
okay, like I said, these weren't
Yep.
objections, I just wanted to know how it worked. Okay, so, have a motion, all right, so these are two
Two separate RFPs.
Two separate
Mhm.
RFPs. Can we do them both at once, or just one? each
I
one?
moved both of them at once already.
Aye, second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Yep.
Aye, okay.
It's pursuant to town meeting authority anyway.
And I think next, Christian, rail trail.
Somebody forget their Chromebook. I'm Christian Donner, 92 Green Street, and I am here to update on the rail trail status. And the first update is that we had an extraordinary fundraising party at Michael Taylor's barn last Sunday. It was really a great event, and Ben Simino cheering up the crowd, Jay Hodge working the magic on his smoker. We had a 7th wave keg of IPA, and raised over $5,000, and those donations are still coming in.
Congratulations.
So that was good. That's the good news. In other news, the Board of Selectmen received a draft copy of the rail trail lease from the MBTA back in September, and it has been under review. And myself and a few other folks had a conference call with Mark yesterday where we went over and learned about a number of concerns specifically around insurance coverage and limits. And we also determined that some of these provisions seem to have been added compared, when you compare the lease language with what Needham signed back in 2014
14.
or 15. It's more onerous to Medfield, and what we are proposing that we want to do is go back to the MBTA and see if we can request that these terms will be more aligned with the language that is in place for Newton and Needham at this point. And so unfortunately, we thought we would be here today and ask you to vote on signing the lease, but we don't think we're quite ready for that. We want to go through this additional effort in getting back to the MBTA. And so that implies also asking, I'm not sure if this is a formal process, but asking for permission to negotiate with the MBTA on behalf of the town on these terms.
Oh, so it would be this conversation that we referred to, what was being asked was that you authorize the Alliance to go back to the T on the town's behalf and try to get the terms more aligned with the existing signed leases. So you're not binding yourself to sign something that they come back with, you're just authorizing them to act on your behalf for that purpose. And it was suggested that a vote to that effect would be helpful.
One quick question, have we, would have been a year or two ago, so I apologize with my memory. Have we seen a copy of, so if we ask you to do that, have we seen a copy of any of those leases?
Yeah, it's right here. This is
Needham
Needham.
lease was in our materials.
I guess I skipped the Needham lease because I went through this one, is what it was.
This is a signed Needham lease.
So that's signed, and that would be the 2014 version?
Correct.
All right, I have to go back and read that, because,
So it's got a date filled in here, so you know what you're looking
okay,
at.
no, I do, it was there, and I skipped over it because I got far enough into this draft
This-
that I
This
didn't want to.
document captioned alternate, it's got a blank 2019 date for Medfield. It has provisions that were not in the Needham lease that are more onerous to the town. It's got more insurance requirements, it's got a lot of, not a lot, but and it's still not gonna be great even when all is said and done, but at least it won't be as bad as it is now.
The reason I'm asking the question is that aside from the insurance, I had lots of questions with, but I also, and I defer to you, I'll defer to any of the three of you as lawyers, but I'm reading things where the MBTA is basically saying, Medfield, you take on full liability for what happens here, and we can come in and do what we want, and I'm looking at.
Oh, it's very
them as-
one-sided, there's
Yeah,
no question
yeah.
about that.
So if those kinds of provisions are in the Needham lease, just because you negotiate something like that, I still will have heartburn unless somebody can assure me that they're not.
Well, you can read the Needham
Yeah, I'll
lease as
do
a
that, I'll do that.
baseline, and I think you're gonna find that, yeah, they pretty well retain all kinds of discretion, and yes, and this was something we discussed on the phone yesterday, that ultimately, even if there's a volunteer group, a nonprofit group that is doing the work, as far as the T is concerned, their contract, if you will, is with the town, and it's the town that they're going to hold responsible. So you need to be very aware of what's in the document, whatever it is, and ultimately, you're gonna have to make a political decision on whether it's acceptable.
So Chris, only because you're doing all the heavy lifting here, speaking is just on my
Others.
own.
Others are doing the heavier lifting.
Well, you guys have done more heavy lifting than I have on this. The issue I found myself looking at is I said, when the Bay Circuit Trail wanted to relocate their path, we had issues, but the point was they came, we just said, yeah, tell us where you want to put it, stay off private property, don't cut down private trees, but, you can do that. And I'm reading this thing, and I'm saying, for a 1.3 mile trail in a town that has so much open space, do we really need to drag ourselves into this kind of century-long exposure if what we want is a 1.3 mile trail? And there's a part of me that wants to do it because I know the Norfolk Hunt Club would like access, so I'm not against it philosophically, but I'm looking at the thickness of this lease and saying, give me a break. This is a trail, and it's got things about
Okay.
utilities, and, anyway. So
Let
I
me
want
just
you to
spend-
know where I'm coming from before you try to figure something out.
I was actually, I was gonna ask that question. Are there any, after you guys reviewing
Yeah.
these documents, are there any other questions aside from what we're trying to address here? And so that seems to be one.
Mhm.
I think that, we're not gonna resolve it here.
Yeah.
But just in a minute, we are, and that's my perspective of this, we're not talking about a 1.3 mile stretch. We are talking about getting somewhere eventually. And I do think the vision of having access to the Needham commuter rail station through that trail on bicycles remains alive.
Mhm.
Dover has had some developments lately where the Friends of the Dover Greenway had discussions with the Board of Selectmen, and it sounds like, and this is secondhand information, but it sounds like they were in principle on board with the volunteer group assigning the lease for the land and managing that, or at least acting as an intermediary. And so that some of the roadblocks that were in place for a number of years there seem to be in the process of going away. So that's encouraging, because that means it's more likely that we can connect. And as that, it is something that's very different from the open space that we have in other places in town. So I feel as enthusiastic about this as I have been from day one, and it's been 10 years now that I've been working on this. And I think that hopefully, we can convince you that there is.
To be clear, this is close to my house. I would love to be able to ride my bike to the Needham train station. But on a personal level, there's nothing at all about this. I'm reading this thing from the standpoint of the liabilities that the town is accepting. And part of me says, oh, they're onerous, but they're not gonna happen. And I'm wrestling with the responsible decision for the selectmen to
Yeah.
make. Taking on the liability to restore the roadbed either to the improvement level that we put or to the original level, potentially a century from now, is a daunting thing for me to contemplate.
You plan to be
It's-
around then?
Huh? Well, I don't, no. It'll just be how they write it up in the history. When Richard DeSorger does his third volume, that'll feature Franklin as one of the. But it's not like I don't want this to happen, it's
Yeah.
that I'm looking at this and it's like, I find myself saying, well, is this gonna be about as good as they run the T? It's like.
They're notorious. Any attorney who's has had any interaction with them will tell you this is where they are, and they'll basically say, here's our standard agreement, take it or leave it, if you want what it is. They don't even actually know what they have for properties, they don't know what the liabilities are.
And they don't take responsibility for that either.
Right, so they've drafted this document that's basically saying,
Right.
here it is.
So I'm a T lawyer, and I walked into my boss and said, you know what, I just figured out a scheme to make sure we're insulated from all environmental liability for the next century.
Yeah, no,
Here
I
it
don't,
is.
I don't defend, I'm certainly not gonna defend the T. I think what we have to do, if we want this, is we have to strike a balance between, what's fair and reasonable. Lots of municipalities have signed that lease document around Massachusetts, and they're very happy with the trails that they have. And I think if we can do what we can do to make it more agreeable.
So I
You know,
didn't bring this
then
up
we
to
will try.
depress you, it's just that if you're gonna go put the effort into this, I wanted you to kind of at least get a flavor of the stuff I reacted to, so
Okay.
you know
Yeah,
what the issues are.
appreciate that.
Yep.
Appreciate the feedback.
I think we can send Christian and company back to negotiate and see what they
Yeah.
can.
Absolutely, so moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Yep.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Christian, for giving that depressing send-off. You're willing to accept the commission to do that.
All right.
All right.
Thanks.
Great. Next is Medfield Historic District Commission requests the selectmen vote to appoint Cheryl O'Malley as associate member for 1 year.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, passed. Okay, next. Okay, we're invited to attend an Eagle Court on the November 30th at the United Church of Christ for Alexander B. Fedak and William Michael Maritain at 1 o'clock UCC. That's it. No action other than to, I guess we approve the
Certificates.
signing, yeah, signing of the certificates, so we approve signing the certificates.
Sure, so
Yep,
moved.
all right.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye,
I
done.
think I'll be able to make that one. I don't know about you guys.
I
Fish
think I
might be
can
there.
make it as well.
Eagle Scout season has begun again.
Let's see, discussion,
We did that one.
you did that, that's done. And
We have pending items.
pending, Cultural Council requests $1,000 from the Board of Selectmen Economic Improvement Fund for the Holiday Stroll art installation at the Townhouse. I think this was simply a routine approval of the funding after our discussion at the prior meeting.
So moved.
So I'm just going to say, I'm going to second it. I'm going to say that because I'll vote in favor of this because no one else has asked us to use this money. And so Gene keeps coming with good ideas to use this money. I think, while I think we should commit to support for the security for that event annually, I think this is a one-shot deal to get this off the ground because we're already making it more than a $4,000 investment in that night. But I'm going to second that.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Yep. Aye, okay. That's passed. Update on the Cultural Council issue.
It's actually Medfield
That's
Alliance.
the lease, right?
Cultural Alliance of Medfield,
Cultural Alliance of Medfield.
Inc.
Correct.
Where'd that lease go? So this is the updated lease? You have anything we need to know, or?
Yes, this was sent to me by Vicky Sheps late last week. I had hoped to have it to you earlier for review and comment, and there was some snafus that didn't result, but I've been through it, I've made some comments myself. I'm asking you to look at it in light of the memorandum I gave you on October 15th, that checklist. In particular, as you read it through, to what degree have the concerns that I've outlined there been addressed? So I need some guidance back from you individually. I would suggest that you either correspond with me directly or with Chris, not copying each other on it, and then decide at what point you want to discuss it publicly if that's necessary.
I'm prepared to discuss. I've already gone through it. I don't know about the two of
I
you.
missed it when it came in.
Okay.
I read the email, didn't realize. it
So
was-
I would rather have them hear what I have to say, and then I can actually hand this to you if you want. Pete, I don't know if you're ready to talk about it.
I want to take another look at
And
Mark's
Gene's here,
bullets.
so I'd like you
Sorry,
all
what
to hear it.
I just want to take another look at your bullet points that you're
I
referring to.
got extra copies tonight if you need it.
Thank you.
Does anyone else need a copy of that? That's that memo I did last time. So some issues are more important than others. So if you want to, if I just throw out the issues that without going into them with great specificity, but the things I think you need to address is, there is a phasing attachment to this lease. It doesn't give any time frames.
Right.
There's also a lack of provision for oversight by the Board of Selectmen at various junctures, both in terms of the financial abilities of the corporation, the nonprofit, and also the particular proposed improvements, and whether they are acceptable or not, the design and concept, et cetera. I'm particularly bothered, there's reference to arbitration. Generally, I advise clients, municipal clients, against arbitration. And particularly in the context that's here, which is, I think there's other ways to deal with it. And then the other thing, which there's passing reference, the tenant's right to assign, it's in 17G. And that's something that, if you're going to allow it at all, my recommendation would be only with your prior written approval and discretionary with you whether or not you allow it.
With the assent of the landlord, which assent shall not be unreasonably withheld. Right there.
Well, that's not,
I guess my general reaction was that it was it was like a lease between friends. It's not something that, I mean, this isn't like a commercial lease or something that,
no, it's a different term, Pete. The tenant shall have the right to assign this lease to an entity for the purpose of securing funding or tax credits, provided the sublessee agrees in writing to abide by all the terms of the original lease. It's 17G under miscellaneous terms.
But is that a potential, I mean, is that, I managed to pull this up on electronically here. I mean, is that, Gene, is that a
I think it needs to be
potential
discussed.
covenant for a bank or for tax credits? They want to take a security interest in the lease, is that the idea?
The nonprofit can't use them,
Yeah.
so we need a different entity. Whether we form that entity or if there's another developer on the campus or something at the time that could use them, or, you know, we figure out a partnership or something, it would be a different.
But is that to facilitate the sale of the tax credits?
Correct.
You can't sell them?
We can't use them.
I know you can't use them, but usually the recipient of the tax credit then sells the tax credit to somebody who can use them.
As I understand it, that we can't do that as a nonprofit.
Okay, so you'd have to transfer them to somebody else to then,
Right, and Steve Nolan had advised us on that, it's a fairly common
Mhm.
structure
okay.
for these kinds of things, but that's where that language is coming from.
and I don't think we want to stand in the way of that, but I think that we want to have sort of a flexibility to say, yes, that makes sense to us.
So you'd have a for-profit entity that would effectively be the lessee of the property. It would receive the tax credits, pay taxes, and then you would rent, you'd take a sublease or some sort of management agreement from the for-profit entity that's selling the tax credits, and you would get the financial benefit from the tax credits mostly.
Which is the financing for the construction.
Right, right. No, that makes sense to me. Yeah.
But I agree, I don't think it would be a bad thing to have the town be able to weigh in on that.
Those are the major points I have. I mean, there's more technical and refined things, but
Yeah.
those are I believe, the big issues, the lack of a time period, or clear earmarks be met, the lack of clear authority of the Board of Selectmen to make determinations of financial ability and with respect to the project itself, moving forward.
I mean, are you looking, Mark, for guidance from us on going back on those points?
Yeah.
I have no problem if you go back on those points.
Can I add a few that you
You can do whatever you want.
And I'm only doing it now so everybody here can hear it. One, as I read the whole lease, I didn't hear anything that addressed the responsibilities for the site itself as opposed to the inside of the building. And Gene, you brought this up before, around who's responsible for the maintenance of the actual outside of the building. Not that we want to hook the Cultural Alliance into having to do a lot of landscaping, but on the other hand, if there's
We're not even clear what it is they're gonna have at this point.
Right. So my point is, if we aren't clear at what they have, assuming that some portion of it extends beyond the walls of the building, it seems like there should be some clarity that the responsibility is for the maintenance of the building and the designated grounds or something like that, which I didn't see anything on that. But I'm not trying to get you into the hay mowing business here. I'm just trying to make sure that your window boxes are your problem, not ours, which is not always a foregone conclusion in this town. Mark, structurally, on paragraph 3, there are 3 phases. And then in the addendum,
It
there are
elaborates.
4.
Yeah,
So we need to align, and,
phase creep.
yeah, well, I think actually 1 and 2 on the addendum, the fundraising and the assessment phase, I think that's probably really a single phase. But right now, we have the number of phases out of sync. And the other piece that ties in with that, the way this reads, there, like we talk about, when one phase is completed upon the mutual agreement of both parties, the next phase starts. So as I read it, not being a lawyer, I was sitting there saying there are no off-ramps in this. You know, in other words, there's no provision if at the end of the first phase, you don't have agreement, or you get an agreement, but nobody wants to exercise the next phase, it's kind of like automatic, goes into the next phase, the way the wording is, and it seemed like there should be something about mutual agreement to progress to, or
I think the
proceed.
phases themselves need to be defined
Yeah.
in some way, so that you even know when it is.
Right,
Not open-ended and you go to some sort of arbitration to determine whether you're at an impasse or.
and, you know, Gene, I hope you know, my comments here are not a hardball negotiation. This is looking for precision and clarity on what it is we're trying to do.
Right.
And presumably, we would have an agreement about what we're trying to do on this. I just read it, and it seemed like it was fuzzy to me. You talked about the different phases having clear timeframes and clear deliverables. In paragraph 4, this was something that came up before. Paragraph 1 talks about several things, and I brought this up at the last meeting. In that second paragraph, it includes a catering kitchen and concessions to support these activities, yet I don't find anything around catering or concessions in the items that are in paragraph 4. So again, it seems like, just to make it clear that that's something that's allowed, it seems to be that paragraph 4, A, B, C, D, and E, it should be clear that there is something around catering or concessions that's allowed as part of that activity, because then there's a subsequent place in this lease that refers back to paragraph 4. So it drops out that, I'm just trying to make it clear that that's something that's okay to do.
Yeah, where'd you pick up the catering part in the first one?
If you look at the second paragraph in paragraph 1, capital includes flexible
Right.
seating, very
Well,
last
my
line.
recommendation was to meld that with 4.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
4 should be the comprehensive list of
Right.
primary and accessory usage. They shouldn't be in 2 separate places in the lease.
So as a practical matter, my point is, in paragraph 4, I don't see anything about catering or concessions, and it seemed to me that should be, I want it to be included, I don't want it to be dropped, I just don't
I
see
mean,
it.
that first paragraph is more like a vision statement or something
Right.
like that, which is fine, but all the specific uses should be in one place in 4.
But I would add that to paragraph 4. Minor point in paragraph 5, second paragraph, there's a reference, as long as the tenant shall engage, it refers to clause 3. I think, well, now I don't know. I thought you meant clause 1, because clause 3 doesn't address the permitted use of the property, but maybe that should be clause 4. It's just the wrong reference.
Yeah, probably, it moved around.
And there's typos, I'm not gonna waste time on typos.
Right.
On the arbitration, paragraph 16, if we do have arbitration, the only thing when I read this paragraph, it talked about how we would go to arbitration, and there's nothing that says what happens if we don't get agreement on arbitration. Now, maybe from a lawyer's standpoint, it means you go to court, but.
I don't think we should agree to arbitration at all.
Okay, well, if we did,
Take it
I was
out.
just saying that if it
And
didn't
that,
work.
and that,
Okay,
that shouldn't be the mechanism on whether the phasing has been satisfied. There's something, should be more clear cut about that.
I'll defer to the,
I mean,
We will-
I would say, you know, you agree upon a time period, but at the end of that time period, the Board of Selectmen should have the authority to review progress, and if they've determined there's been none, that should be into the they should have the authority to terminate at that point.
But I think what we define as progress should be specific
Right.
numbers, so it's not just some kind of vague standard. It should be if you-
Right, it all needs to be fairly specific.
Yeah. So I think that's gotta come from Jean's side as to what her targets and goals are, and we
You
can.
can always come back in and ask for a modification, you know, if you picked an initial period and it's dragging and you know you're not gonna make it, then well in advance, I approach the selectmen and,
Yeah.
I think
Open
we
a
said
mo-
before,
open a
we weren't
negotiation.
the intent wasn't to make that draconian.
Yeah,
It
and I
was
think our
just
discretion should be
specified.
limited
Right.
if you hit the numbers. If you hit the numbers that are set out,
Yeah.
that should be it. And you can show that proof of what it is. There's not gonna be a decision to be made. We shouldn't have the discretion to terminate it if you've met the.
no, no.
the-
Gene, is there anything about this discussion in terms of, because we're not trying to nail you, we're just trying to be clear. Is there anything about what we're talking about here that will hamper your ability to get funding, financial support? So we're not putting in any onerous terms here that would influence, okay. So on the addendum, the observations I had, I think you talked about target times, there's,
Whatever the periods, time period, if a time period makes sense, that you have X number of years to do
Right.
this, or
So that-
some, or
right.
within that,
So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it, it seems to me, for every phase, there should be, unless we deliberately do not want to have any town oversight in a particular phase. In the very first phase, we talk about the financial reporting, and then after that, there's no mechanisms for any oversight specified at all. So if that's what we really are intending to do, that's fine, but it seemed, I just missed any hard accountability loops there.
if they had a relatively short period of time to do money raising, then you get to the end and they'd say either they've made it or not. If they've got a longer term, then you probably want to be updated and determine whether there's been any progress made, or they're on target or whatever.
During operations,
Again,
it's an
I'd leave
annual
it to you to
report or something,
suggest
I would
that.
guess, but, I had one other thing on that, though. We have provisions for the renovations. There's no provisions in here, and again, I'm thinking this is a 99-year lease, so I'm thinking in terms of centuries.
Right.
There's no provision if at some point, 50 years down the road, the Cultural Alliance, this may be beyond your time, Gene, or maybe not, but if there were a point where they wanted to do something, there's no provision beyond the initial concept for what needs to happen if the Cultural Alliance wants to make another improvement or another modification. There's no mechanism that
Again,
says-
my recommendation is anything significant should be, there should be a mechanism to be reviewed by the town and okayed.
That's my
It's
point.
still ultimately the town's property.
Well, but I mean, what do we need? I'm just thinking in the terms of oversight, Gus. Once it's up and running,
Mhm.
I mean, it's a lease, right? The oversight comes from the terms of the lease. And I would think if they're operating and they've successfully developed a cultural center there, and they're acting within the permitted uses, I'm not sure there's any oversight that's needed. I mean, for the other, like, for example, like we rent the land to the Kingsbury Club.
That's a ground lease. They
Ground lease. I get it, but do we get like an annual report from them, like on how many people played tennis there and what happened? I think we get a check, and as long as the check comes in and
No,
they're
but we had
compliant
the,
with
we
lease.
had the oversight when, in terms of approval of what they were gonna construct and how they were gonna.
Absolutely. No, we have that too.
Right.
Right. I mean, all I'm saying is in terms of what kind of reporting is gonna go on, it seems to me, once it's built, it's a lease, and the lease.
No, we're not
def-
talking that, no, the oversight I'm talking about is for any structural improvements.
Oh, yeah,
they're
yeah, well,
gonna
they have to renegotiate the lease. I mean, the lease says, here's what you can do with it. If it's outside what it says in the lease, you gotta come renegotiate the lease, just like the Kingsbury Club had to come back to us and say, we wanna build these pickleball courts, and we had a
Right.
negotiation, and they built the pickleball.
In other
courts.
words, if it, conceptually, I don't know what it's, I was in there years ago, but suppose hypothetically, they were gonna gut the place and make a huge open-air facility with modular things and move around. That might be fine, but we ought to know about
Roller
it and
derby or
say it's
something?
okay before, what?
Like roller derby, or?
No, they have like theaters up at Brandeis where they have whole sets of seats that move around, they can,
So
It could be
the
done that way.
situation I was thinking of was more, I think the plans to renovate the building have to be submitted to the town, and
Right.
we get to approve them. So this initial renovation, the plans go to the town. If we're into operation, and 25 years into operation, suddenly the Cultural Alliance says, you know what, that connector between the two buildings, we want to change that connector. One option is, well, as long as you don't violate the design guidelines, have at it. The other is, do they need to do something similar to what they needed to do when they first renovated the building to make a subsequent change? There's nothing in here that I saw that obligated them to do anything. If, I can be talked out of this, if the answer is no, as long as they stay within the lease, let them do what they want, I'm fine with that.
Well, I just don't know if the lease would let them do that, what you're describing. I mean, the lease identifies what they can do with the buildings, right? It's not, you can do anything you want with the buildings, and unless we say no, it says you can do these things with the buildings.
Activity-wise, you're talking.
Activity-wise.
Yes.
Right, and then in terms of construction, I mean, for any alterations to the buildings, they'd have to get a building permit, they'd have to get any number of adjustments. I mean, maybe we can put in there that if you're going to alter the buildings, you have to get the permission of the landlord, and that's fine too.
Surrounded
Right.
by 3 lawyers, I will very happily pull back my question.
No.
I'm reading it as not a lawyer, and I'm saying, well, gee, I don't see anything about this. If you say, don't worry about it, Gus.
No, I'm not saying
there are
don't
other
worry
things.
about it, I'm just saying, I don't want there to be, I mean, look, it's gonna be well after we're all at least off this board. But, I mean, I don't wanna be in a situation where there's oversight in the sense of
Yeah.
anything substantive. I mean, if we wanna say, add a term that says if you're gonna alter the building in a certain way, you've gotta come to the landlord for
Right.
permission, right? And if we think the way the lease is written now, that they could alter the building without permission, we gotta have a term that says you wanna alter the building, you should get permission.
That's
So
all.
that's not
all
oversight,
right.
that's just if you wanna alter the building, you gotta come get permission.
Right.
It's not like filing an annual report or anything like that. I mean, once they have it going, they're a lessee and they lease the property.
On the addendum under section 1F, minor point, then the last line, then the parties shall enter arbitration is defined under article, it's not 18, it's 16. There is no article 18.
It's not defined there anyway, so.
Okay, that's basically all I have.
So did you want to hear my issues at this point, or do you want to just give you the list, the sheet with them?
It's up to you, the other two are here if you wanna.
I'm happy to hear them, Pete. I apologize for
first
not
thing-
doing my homework on this issue.
The first thing that I would bring up is that under the term, it self-extends, and I'm not sure in 99 years whether I wanted to self-extend or not, so I just thought we
You
could
can make
think
that
about
judgment in
that.
99 years about that. You may still be here, Pete. I don't know. What
I
the
was,
rest of
I was interested today because I was actually doing looking at a life table because of a brief that I was submitting to the court. And so of course I had to check and see how many years I had left.
Depressing.
And I didn't get to 99. There was, under the insurance clause, I would just have it say that things aren't going to increase the costs of the town without reimbursement. The tenants are-
Is that established, the building will continue on the town's inventory as far as, property damage casualty goes?
Yeah. Well, right now, it's not on there at all. We would have to add it. Right now, it's
Right.
covered under our separate insurance.
That's no separate
So-
cost for the town then, huh? Well, we should probably get a cost on that to figure out how much that is then.
We can estimate on it.
Under the insurance clause 8B, I just didn't understand what the tenant's representative begins assessing the property, whichever occurs first. The parties agree that the obligation shall begin until the tenant begins undertaking. Yeah, I just didn't understand what that meant. Destruction of the premises, I would suggest that we have that be triggered by a determination by the landlord as to whether or not the property has been destroyed, and the lease terminates.
Well, considering they're only paying nominal rent, they're frankly not gonna have an incentive to be arguing that the lease is terminated if it's at all salvageable.
Right, but if we want to be terminating it, I think that we just, that should be our call. And then that language that I mentioned to you before under the paragraph that you were talking about, that we should be consulted with regard to any sort of assignment of the lease. And that was it.
All right, well, if anybody has anything else, if you get it to me, what I'll do is I'll consolidate everything and get it back to Vicky Sheps.
There's a lot of typo stuff there, so I think you'll follow it. Okay. I think we've got consent agenda next.
I would move the consent agenda items then.
Second.
I have one item that I just want to raise a question.
Oh.
I'm just like on a roll today. No, the only question I have, and it's not, we can approve it. The high school asked for the spaghetti with Santa, which is fine, but also asked to put signs up in April 14th, 2020, which is like 6 months from now. And as a practical matter, we won't remember that we approved signage that far out. So the only question I have, not because it's the high school, but just from a policy standpoint, do we care whether we get sign requests 6 months in advance when we are absolutely not?
I don't think anybody's really tracking those at this point.
Nobody?
Not
Any-
yet.
Do you keep track of them?
Somewhat.
Do you have a record of them?
You've never put a limit on the number of sign requests, so
This is
there's
true.
never been a reason to track them because you
So we will
don't
accept-
say no.
We will accept, do we accept multi-year requests or simply ones that are measured in months in the current?
There-
No more than 99
I
years.
mean, there could be a reason to track them because, so that we can find if there are illegal signs popping up around town
That's
and
true.
that we should be policing,
Okay,
but I don't think, I'm not
I've
sure we
created
care.
enough trouble at this meeting. I'm just gonna pull that all back. You moved that we approve the consent agenda.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye,
Aye.
all right, done. Town administrator update.
I have just one thing tonight. The applications for Hillside Village at 80 North Meadows Road. There are 4 affordable apartments there. They are due tomorrow by 2 o'clock.
Do we have any applications yet?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Let's see, next item is Board of Selectmen action item list, which I think we don't have anything to review. One of these days, we're gonna start using it, so, great.
Pete
Keep
and I,
it- keep it
Pete
on
and
the
I took
agenda.
care of that
Keep
when
it
you
on
were
the
So
gone,
agenda.
it's so
guys.
short right now. There's nothing.
Yeah, we
to put
knocked a
on
bunch
there
of
for.
stuff off in August when you weren't here.
Selectmen report.
So we have the reconstituted, reformulated capital budget committee under our new capital and reserves policy met for the first time a couple of weeks ago. They're going to meet again. We're going to meet again tomorrow. Nick has kind of taken over the process and has put together a very comprehensive list of requests over the next 5 years, with an effort to move towards kind of a true 5-year capital plan as called for under our capital and reserves policy. We have several more meetings. The end result of this will be a recommendation from the capital budget committee to the Board of Selectmen about what should be in the capital budget and then how it will be financed and how we propose to finance the capital budget and what the implications are for that. So I don't know whether we'll actually agree on a recommendation or we'll simply outline the 2 different options for financing the capital budget going forward and the capital items. What we have tried to do and what Nick has done in, rather than just sort of having a list of projects that is kind of tossed in there annually by departments, is under the policy, anything that appears on the 5-year capital budget has to have a proposed source of funding. Now, obviously, some of those sources only come up annually, so it may say in the plan it's going to be funded off of the tax levy. You're not committed to that at the time, but at least you've identified up front that this is where the money is going to come from. We're a little bit behind schedule under the policy. The capital budgeting process is supposed to be completed and approved at the outset of the budgeting process. And so that's locked in as a number at the beginning of the budget season. Given kind of the transitions over the last year, we weren't able to get started as quickly as possible. We're still hoping to be in a position in December to make a recommendation on a final capital budget that would be approved at the beginning of the budget process. Everyone will know what that is. and that will then be locked in heading into the town meeting. I think it's not a surprise to anyone who's followed this that we have underfunded our capital needs considerably over a long period of time. And so we're going to have some difficult decisions to make about whether we want to continue with the same level of programs and services we have now that require capital assets, or reduce those programs and services to reduce the capital cost, or find a way to fund the capital costs that are coming down the road. So more work to be done on that, but ideally by our first meeting in December, there should be a recommendation from the Capital Budget Committee on a 5-year, what we're supposed to be voting on is a 5-year capital budget plan. And if it works the way it's supposed to work, there really won't be that much to do next year, because we've already approved for next year. You'll really be looking at 5 years out for what's coming down the road. We have an Affordable Housing Trust Board of Trustees meeting this Thursday, and I don't remember, Christine, did I forward to you all the presentation we got from Till at our last meeting about the group homes?
don't
If I
believe
sent that
so.
on or not. I'll send on the summary that we got, or have Christine send on the summary we got from that. It was really, as I mentioned at a previous meeting, it was a very impressive presentation. So that's on the, further discussion is on the agenda for that. Our collective bargaining collectively continues. I think our next session is going to be next week. We're trying to
Next
schedule
week sometime.
something next week as we continue those discussions. So I think that, and that covers, we had, since our last meeting, we had a meeting of the Dale Street Building Committee, which I participated thanks to the remote participation policy that you drafted, Gus. I think the meeting was this morning to pick the architect, committee of 13, of which 10 votes are come from the state. So we have a lot of say in that. All right, that's all for me.
So I would start with the Townwide Master Planning Committee's public forum, which I thought was a very successful effort to get opinions from the town. Well-attended, well-run. Went to the planning board hearing on the zoning for the state hospital a couple times with them. Went to the Medfield Coalition for Suicide Prevention. They've actually raised enough funds to cover the Interface, which is that mental health referral organization. They've been very successful, Dr. Hapgood and Sarah Drum, in getting monies from the hospitals that surround us to support that. MCAP was a huge success with the Medfield Coalition Against Cares About Prevention, medfieldcares.org.
You've got too many acronyms.
Yeah. But they were very successful in terms of getting the federal grant, the $625,000 over 5 years to hire a substance use prevention person, $125,000 a year to support that person. And it was a wonderful multiplier effect, because the Medfield Foundation had given them a $5,000 inaugural grant from the Medfield Foundation Legacy Fund grants to hire a grant writer. And that grant writer then turned around and created a $625,000 grant for the town. So congratulations to them. Went to the Medfield TV movie about Mike Sullivan, which was, I thought that was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. Awful lot of selectmen speaking in it, but mainly it was, I guess, Richard DeSorga for the most part, but, and Mark, yeah. If anybody gets a chance, I recommend they see it. And then the Energy Committee met and is getting very active under Fred Davis's chairmanship, and so I think that's going to be very useful to the town. That's it.
Went to a couple of things that Pete mentioned, but on top of that, yesterday, he's in the room here, John Thompson was the guest speaker at the Historical Society's monthly presentation, and I should let John talk about what he talked about, but he kind of really walked through the pictures he had, the historic pictures, and the pictures of how the hospital evolved. We get into the mechanics of developing real estate, but there's this ethereal dimension to Medfield, which the state hospital is clearly a piece of it, that just kind of, it defines to a certain degree, it defines what Medfield is as a town, and there's only a couple people here in town who are good at capturing the essence of that and conveying it to the general public. I think John did that last night, so I enjoyed being there. I thought it was a great presentation, coming at a timely time. We went to the warrant committee meeting last week, which was a useful meeting to go to. The warrant committee has, in the lead up to the special town meeting, has been doing an awful lot of work trying to get their arms around the cost aspects that would be important for the residents to hear at the town meeting, and it's a little hard to come up with a whole lot of cost aspects at this early point where we're just working on zoning. But I think they did a pretty diligent job of trying to get their handle on things. Bottom line was that they were comfortable that at this point in time, they recognize that there are potential financial implications depending on where we go downstream. But at this point, they had done a lot of due diligence and did the best they could of laying out the picture and basically endorsed where we were headed on that. There's I need to probably close the loop with you. Brandy has reached out to me around a flyer to go out just with information. Sarah also had the mailer that came to me, and I'm thinking that the flyer, if it's information for the town meeting, you probably should be involved as well, and I'm not sure, I'm trying to connect with them. But
Yeah, I
we
haven't-
usually do a flyer that comes out of here, so it's a little bit different to have it coming from a,
Yeah, I haven't seen the
different
flyer. I did see
direction.
the postcard today, but I haven't seen the
okay,
flyer.
I don't think a flyer's been written yet, but she
Okay.
was hoping to get something out. I think it's like it normally is, it's informational, it's not advocacy, and that's the main concern
They're
that's
taking
why I
over
wanted to-
taking over my fact sheet. It's
Yeah,
fine.
that's kind of what they're doing, but you ought to get a cut on that. And the last thing I have, just a quick update, I owe you two, or I don't, our committee, the OPEB committee owes you two an update on how the financial side of OPEB has been doing as of the end of the fiscal year at the end of June. I just haven't had a chance to generate the meeting for us to look at that stuff and put that information together. So I don't have anything to report, but I actually owe that to you. And then, Christine, something to think about between you and Nick. Mike was on that committee. You probably, if you could give me a recommendation on who you would like to have pick that. I'm assuming one or the other of you should be on it. But we should figure that out and get that person added. Nick, just so you know, if it's you, it's not a heavy lifting committee. This is the finance side. This is put the money in and make sure it doesn't go anywhere and it continues to grow. It's not the other side of it, which is how do we figure out how to generate $26 million that we can just contribute to OPEB. So, that's all I had. I think that's all we have overall. Yes?
Hi, Gus. I just wanted to thank you guys for the time you donate to this cause. I think a lot of people in town forget that you are unpaid or underpaid for what you do. Your stipend, I'm sure, goes very far in paying for the gas to get over here, but that's about it. And on the same vein, I want to make sure that everyone in the town realizes what a great support group you have in people like John Thompson, and Gene. It's just unbelievable. Everyone is doing this out of the goodness of their own heart for the betterment of the town. And anything we can do to help each other out in order to get these causes done. The rail trail is a fine example of, hey, how can we help get this thing done? We understand the hurdles. We understand that the MBTA is not going to bend or break, but we also need to understand that this is the people. There's a groundswell of support for this and has been for years. So I'm just encouraged that decisions are going to be made and that town keeps moving forward, because a town that is stifled not only stops growing but goes the other way. So I appreciate all that you guys do.
Thank you.
Dick, you should come to more of our meetings.
I thought he was going to say how much he appreciated it, but didn't realize the entertainment value of the Board of Selectmen's meetings until he showed up. Just before we close, there are also, and I'm saying this because there's some other people here in the room that show up on a quite aside from Medfield TV, which is a tremendous asset. So there's some people here in this room that even if they don't have official capacities, have, there's a small
Designated
number of people
seats.
in the town who take the time to try to understand at least some of the issues. And because they do that, they're an invaluable, even when we disagree with them, they're an invaluable sounding board to bring perspectives in, and the willingness to put the time in. And in the case of some of the regular attendees here that do that, it makes a big difference in, I think, what we're capable of doing, so.
And progress.
Yes.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
very good. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
You're watching Medfield TV.